Hello, everyone. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers the global war on terror and so much more. I'm Bill Roggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Today, we have John Hardie. He's the deputy director of FDD's Russia program, and we are going to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine. John, welcome to Generation Jihad. It's great to talk to you again.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be back.
Yeah, so we've had it's been a bit since we've had a conversation. We've had a lot go on. This battlefield seems kind of static. So today, what we're going to do a quick recap, a battlefield update recap. What's happening? Where is it happening? What isn't happening? And then there was a recent change of command that I recommend you go over to Long War Journal and read John Hardie's article on that. It's quite interesting. We'll have a conversation about that as well. So first, let's tell us what's happened in the last, I guess it's been over a month since we talked. How has there been a lot of developments on the battlefield?
Sure. So as you mentioned, it's a bit static in terms of territory changing hands. That's not to say that the fighting hasn't been intense. It still is quite intense in certain sectors of the front, which we'll talk about shortly. But really, I think overall, big picture, we are in a bit of a transition phase. I think since Russia withdrew across the Dnieper River in Kherson Oblast, Russia's been trying to stabilize its defensive lines. I think in general, it's been able to do that due to various factors, weather, whether it be mud or lack of foliage for cover. The Russian commander, erstwhile Russian commander, really did a good job of having Russian forces across the battlefield build strong fortified defensive lines, something he did well in Kherson Oblast and he applied elsewhere as well. And then I think a big factor has been greater Russian force density, so ratio of forces to territory that they're trying to defend. That's due to a variety of things, whether it be a contracted front line, mobilization, and the redeployment of forces from the Kherson direction eastward, while using the Dnieper River as a natural barrier in the west. So, and Ukraine's done the same thing, by the way. But some of Ukraine's really best units, I think, have needed some time to rest and refit after months of really grinding fighting in Kherson.
Let's talk about the fighting in the Bakhmut area. The Russians have made some gains along this particular front. This is a key terrain for Russia in Donetsk. I think they are really looking to, Putin has made this a priority, very clear. Would you agree with that, John? That's where he's looking to focus to get a victory there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, just the stated goals at this point are to take the rest of the Donbass. And so obviously, excluding the sliver of Luhansk Oblast that's now been lost to Ukraine, they're taking the rest of Donetsk is really the chief task. Whether Putin would actually be satisfied with stopping there is, anyone's guess, but that's the stated goal.
Yeah. So what have we seen in the Bakhmut front? What has gone on over the last, I'd say probably month or so? Have the Russians made gains there?
Right. So if you look back, actually the past few months, it's been really grinding fighting, led primarily by the Wagner so-called private military group. It's, of course, basically an extension of the Russian Defense Ministry, funded primarily by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a businessman close to the Kremlin. They've been the lead in that area. And so basically the Russians are trying to encircle Bakhmut from the north and south. And they've had some tactical successes over the past few months. Most recently last week in Soledar, a city, a resort and mining city to the north. I think they've probably taken all of that or are very close to and are actually pushing a little bit more to the west and southward. And then below Bakhmut to the south, the Russians have made a little bit of gains as well. But again, this is coming it's very grinding fighting. And the rate of gains is fairly slow when you think about the amount of time and resources that they've put into this. So, whether this will turn, it's clearly a tactical victory for Russia, especially over the last week. Prigozhin and Wagner and the Russian military in general have really played it up as such. And surprisingly, But whether they'll be able to turn this tactical success into operational victory, I think to me, I'm very skeptical for a number of reasons that we can go into.
Yeah, John, I'm actually in agreement with you. This is definitely a tactical victory. This is something Putin wanted to achieve, the Russian military. If they had done this 4 months ago, they may have been able to, and if they had actually mobilized and used their forces properly, they may have been able to capitalize on this front and been able to drive forward. But the Ukrainians, they've proven to be resilient and tenacious, and they've clearly had time even if they do lose Bakhmut. Right, I saw a Ukrainian commander yesterday say that it did appear that Solidar has been lost. That's after about a week of denials from Ukrainian officials. But again, it's the battlefield static. I'm not going to imply that someone wasn't being truthful. It seems that the last neighborhood or district in
Right.
Solidar probably the Ukrainians withdrew from that. But
Exactly.
I mean, they're clearly making the Russians pay a price, but the Ukrainians are paying a price here. But to summarize that, I agree with you. I don't think there's a lot that the Russians can exploit from this victory in Solidar. It will make holding on to Bakhmut a little more difficult for the Ukrainians, and it does make it does the Ukrainians. It's costly for them to mount this defense, but I think this is baked in. This is calculated. What the Ukrainians are doing, they're grinding down the Russian machine.
Yeah, I think for Ukraine, there is an interesting, I think, debate here. We've seen it break out into the press some about whether it's worth it to be throwing in reinforcements into Solidar and into the back area in general. It's sort of a parallel to a similar debate that Ukrainians had around Lysychansk and Severodonetsk over the summer, when it's just very intense fighting, high casualties on both sides. And I think there's some debate as to whether Ukraine would be better off reserving those forces, keeping them fresh for what we all expect is going to be an attempt at another major counteroffensive later this year. But to your point, at the same time, the Ukrainians are taking heavy losses, so are the Russians. And it could be that the strategic loss for Russia is greater in terms of manpower and perhaps more importantly, materiel. There have been indications that Russia's artillery rate of fire has dropped, including in that area. So I think it's clear that they seem to be conserving ammunition, whether that's because they just want to save it up, or whether they really have to begin conserving now is an open question. I think some debate within the Russian military watcher community, but it is clear that whatever the stores they do have, I think they probably will begin to run into availability problems sometime this year. So for Russia, I think you do have to wonder about the strategic wisdom of this offensive. It does seem like there's an element of perhaps personal promotion on the part of Prigozhin, and then for Putin, perhaps a political imperative to continue to show gains. As we've discussed, I don't really see a great prospect for Russia turning, even if they were to take Bakhmut, turning that into operational victory. Ukraine can fall back to a secondary defensive line at Chasiv Yar, and then Russia, because they've lost their presence at Izium, really doesn't have a great prospect of pushing northward from Bakhmut to try to take Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the two big remaining cities in Donetsk Oblast. So I think for Russia, you have to wonder, is this something that Surovikin and now the other generals in charge really think is a great idea, or is it something they're being forced to do by their political master?
Yeah, I really wish you could be a fly on the wall and to hear those
No
discussions,
doubt,
right?
no doubt.
Is this being dictated from on high? Is this a political strategy or is this a military strategy? Because it doesn't seem like a good military strategy to me at this point. But you mentioned, John, what are the Russian capabilities? What is its stockpiles of material are they going to have problems? This has been the real big question. All of this is a black hole for us, and we're trying to figure that out. We're guessing. I said this early in the war. I'll go back to this. No matter what the outcome of this war, do we have a stalemate? Do the Ukrainians take back all their territory, or do the Russians slowly grind away? One thing that's very, very clear to me is that the Russians are not a conventional military threat to NATO. particularly to Western Europe, perhaps in Latvia, Lithuania, in the in that area where they're directly bordering. But the Russians have proven that militarily, if they couldn't roll through the Ukrainians. I have little confidence that they're a direct conventional military threat to NATO. I think that has been demonstrated during this fighting. But I'm not sure what your opinion of that is, John. But you could comment on that, and then let's after that let's take a look at the Crimea area. You had mentioned that earlier, and Ukraine seems to be making some small gains in this area, and I actually think this is an area where the Ukrainians may be the focus of their next offensive. But I'm curious in your opinion.
Yeah. So on the first topic, it really deserves a podcast in and of itself. But just quickly, I'd say, yeah, I mean, this is not the same military that Russia went into the war with, and I think we can debate about whether that Russian military was a conventional threat. I think, in many ways, Russia did not put its best foot forward, and so I wouldn't take the way this war has gone and the outcome to be determinative or necessarily perfectly reflective of the pre-February 24, 2022 Russian military.
I concur with that, John. Yeah, I'm talking. I was mentioning and today.
Yeah, and so going forward, it will certainly take the Russian military a lot of time to rebuild, and some things I think will be lost. So, and I'm not the first to note this, but the Soviet inheritance of a massive amount of artillery stockpiles and a bunch of old tanks that while old can be put into service, a lot of that isn't going to be rebuilt just because the Russian defense industrial base is not the Soviet one. So in that sense, some things are never coming back. In terms of the newer stuff, I think actually we'd be surprised about how quickly Russia is able to regenerate that stuff. I think for all the talk about export controls, the Russians do a pretty good job of evading them, and their defense industrial base right now does seem to be cranking along. So yeah, I think they will be able to restore some of that fairly quickly. I think their biggest problem will be the people, really. How do they recruit and retain contract personnel? Russia has a terrible command culture problem that needs to be addressed. I don't think it will be. So yeah, I think they'll remain a conventional threat to Eastern Europe. Perhaps after a period of rebuilding. They never, in my opinion, were never much of a conventional threat to Western Europe just because their logistics are so tied to rail. And the Soviet-made rail system ends with the former Soviet Union, and it's actually a different gauge when you go into the Western outside of that. So, yeah, I don't think they're ever able to really project power, conventional military power, much further than that.
It's all about logistics. All right, let's go. Let's move forward. Let's talk to us about the Crimea area. What's happening there? Real briefly. How are the Ukrainians progressing in this front?
Sure. So essentially what Russia's tried to do is, after the debacle in Kharkiv Oblast, and then after losing the town of Liman, Russia's tried to consolidate a defensive line stretching from Crimea up to Svatovia and then up to the Russian-Ukrainian border. And Russia's done a fairly good job of holding that line, but Ukrainians have chipped away some, especially at the southern end of that line around Crimea, which is just northwest of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, the cities I mentioned earlier, the ones that Russia worked so hard to take back during the summer. So I think in terms of immediate prospects for further Ukrainian gains, this is where we have to look. Whether this is the sector that Ukraine is going to prioritize for its next big counteroffensive remains to be seen, but it's certainly a good candidate.
Quick question before we'll step off and take a look at the bigger picture. What do you think about the Ukrainians' prospects of advancing further east in the Kherson region across the Dnipro River? Do you think do you think the Russians have established their defensive line effectively? When I take a look at this, the two likely areas, but do you think there's what's the other possible areas where the Ukrainians may launch their next counteroffensive?
Yeah, so if they pick the south for the counteroffensive, I don't think they'll try to go over the Dnieper River. I think it'd be in Zaporizhia Oblast, pushing that way. It'd be a pretty tough ask to cross the Dnieper River, a very risky operation. Russia really had too easy of a time doing it early on in the war, and I don't think Ukrainians would have that easy of a time. And yes, Russia has established several defensive lines in the left bank or eastern bank of Kherson Oblast.
Okay. Great. Okay, let's take a look at the big picture now. What have both sides been doing in this? And again, I'm just I don't want to downplay. There's been heavy fighting, but in this relative lull, in this sort of this static environment that has developed over the last several months, what are we looking at here from both the Ukrainian and the Russian sides of this war?
Sure. So, as I mentioned at the top, it's a bit of a transitional phase. I think both sides have tried to use this period to generate and regenerate forces in anticipation of major moves sometime this year. So, for Ukraine, there's talk of a major counteroffensive. I think the Russians, especially Putin, does want to try to get back on the offensive, regain the strategic initiative, and relaunch major offensive operations. If not, in the winter, perhaps later this year. So for Ukraine, basically they're trying to take Western military aid, and they're trying to encourage the continuation of the flow of Western military aid and use that to equip additional units and accumulate materiel for a counteroffensive. The U.S. and their allies are trying to facilitate that by adapting their aid packages. You've probably seen the announcement of Bradley's, and then the training sort of being tweaked as well, with the U.S. launching a program for combined arms training in Germany.
Oh, before we get to Russia, John, real quick on that. So, do we have an indication of how many Bradley fighting vehicles the Ukrainians are going to get? I haven't seen anything on that.
I believe the announcement was 50, and of course, those aren't the only vehicles that were announced in that package and earlier ones, but it's clearly a step up from what Ukraine has gotten previously.
Does this introduce a logistical problem for the Ukrainians for maintenance and such with introducing, like I said, a new weapon system? The Ukrainians really have had a hodgepodge. I don't think this is really. I had actually thought earlier on in the war that this would become a major headache for the Ukrainians, but they seem to be able to manage this. It's hard to determine how well they've managed it, but managed it well enough that they launched two major offensives. Do you think that's a problem that the Ukrainians are going to encounter, or do you think that the Western support will overcome this hodgepodge of material that the Ukrainians are getting from the West?
Yeah, so it's certainly a challenge. I think the Ukrainians will tell you that as well. But of course, they'd rather have that headache than have the other problem, which is not getting any Western aid. So
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and again, I do think they've done well. Again, they've had tactical and strategic success on the battlefield. So let's move on to Russia. Let's what has Russia been doing during this time?
Sure. So for Russia, it's a bit of a similar story. Obviously, they had the mobilization announced back in September. So we saw with the mobilization some troops being thrown straight in to the front lines to try to stabilize the lines and plug holes. Other troops are kind of filling out staffing tables in existing units, and then a big chunk of the mobilized forces, according to Putin, 150,000. The exact number is unknown to me, but I think a big chunk remain in Russia and are basically being formed to a combat reserve. So they're getting more training, better training, at least in theory. And Russia is forming new units, new regiments. That is, at least to my mind, Putin likely hopes to use to relaunch major offensive operations. Now, at the same time, of course, Russia, kind of like Ukraine, is looking abroad for materiel. So the loitering munitions, the Shahid 131s and 136s that we've heard so much about from Iran. And of course, there's been reports of potential deal for short-range ballistic missiles. And then from North Korea, artillery ammunition. It seems like Russia has gotten some of that ammunition from North Korea, although at least based on reports from the IC, not a heck of a lot.
This sort of circles back to the Ukrainians. We had the last time we talked, we were discussing the Russian air offensive, or they've been launching missile and drone strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, particularly power infrastructure, water, things of that nature. Are we seeing any indications that the Ukrainians are depleting their air defense artillery? Has this become a problem for the Ukrainians? This is a really difficult one to gauge, because I think at some point what this will do is going to force the Ukrainians to either defend their battlefield units or defend their infrastructure, assuming that there is a problem with stockpiles of Ukrainian air defense artillery. Any indication of that?
Right. So for I think a few months now, at least, Ukraine has had a problem with dwindling stockpile of missile interceptors for the Buk M1 medium range system. This is their workhorse mobile medium range surface to air missile system. That is a big issue because if they run out of those, it really blow a big hole in Ukraine's air defense coverage, and it could allow more freedom of action to Russia's air force, which so far has really been not a non-factor, but it has really underperformed in this war. So the prospect of them kind of getting back in the game is not a good one for Ukraine. So Ukraine has been able to supplement with a lot of other, some other Western provided surface-to-air missile systems. And like you said, anti-aircraft artillery. Ukraine has gotten some German systems. Now, Germany never had a lot of ammunition for those. I think ammo is probably a problem there. Unfortunately, the Swiss are holding up deliveries of additional ammo. So yeah, I think that is a problem for Ukraine. At the same time, Russia's supply of these Iranian-provided loitering munitions is not infinite, and we have seen periods where the strikes have really fallen off because Russia exhausted its supply and had to wait on another batch. So I think it's really up to how quickly Iran can deliver them. Based on press reports and declassified intelligence, it sounds like Russia is trying to localize production, but it's unclear when that'll actually come online or how many Shahed it'll be able to produce before the war ends.
Let's move on to that Russia command shakeup. It's going to be a little bit of criminology here with some names of some generals and who's friends with who and whatnot. Go ahead and walk us through this, John. Give us the top level view of what's happening here and how do you think this will impact the battlefield in the months to come?
Sure. So I think I should actually back up to the beginning. So when Russia began its so-called special military operation in Ukraine back in February of last year, it appeared to lack an overall commander of all its forces in Ukraine, just highly irregular.
Stunning.
Really. I mean, usually unity of command is kind of the military 101.
Right.
So the fact that they didn't, and there probably was some coordination in the cell they set up in the general staff or whatever. But bottom line, they didn't have an overall commander, and it really showed. Basically, 4 different groupings of forces in Ukraine, commanded by the heads of their respective military districts. Competition for strategic resources like air support and missiles or what have you. So eventually. Putin did appoint an overall, or at least based on U.S. intelligence, did appoint an overall commander, Dvornikov, who was the commander of the southern grouping of forces, Southern Military District. He was quickly fired. It was rumored that someone took his place, but it doesn't seem like he lasted long, if he ever was actually appointed. And then finally, we had Sergei Surovikin, the head of the Russian aerospace forces, who had also taken over command of the southern grouping of forces. And I think he was really the first true commander in that, he got the reins. He was formally announced he was the first one to be formally announced. And I think it seems like Putin listened to him a bit more. Surovikin was evidently able to convince Putin to allow him to withdraw forces across the Dnieper River in Kherson Oblast. So it just based on Putin's statements, it seems like he was getting a clearer picture of the reality on the ground from Surovikin. So, and it seems like Surovikin had Putin's confidence. In December 2022, Putin gave him an award right on New Year's Eve, seemingly, indicating that he had Putin's confidence. But then on January 11th, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced a shakeup whereby the chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov, is taking over as the overall commander. Surovikin will be his deputy alongside 2 other generals. Really a strange move, surprisingly. I think it caught the Russian military press and military blogger community off guard as well, because it really didn't make a whole lot of military sense. Surovikin seemed to be doing a good job. He had brought a more competent command to the Russian forces, which is something they were sorely lacking. He had stabilized the lines, pulled off a really difficult retrograde operation in Kherson without heavy casualties, something many Westerners didn't think what he'd be able to do. anyways, Putin, makes this change, and it's obvious that despite the MOD statement saying the defense minister Sergei Shoigu appointed Gerasimov, it's obviously Putin had to make the call. To my mind, the only thing that really makes sense is some sort of internal power political play by Shoigu and Gerasimov, who really had been seemingly sidelined for a while. Putin was giving orders directly to commanders, Surovikin and others, and so I think Shoigu and Gerasimov, who are obviously responsible for the debacle back during the first phase of the war, alongside the FSB, they seem to be sort of in the doghouse, so to speak. But nevertheless, here they come with this move. They essentially reassert themselves back at the center of this war, and perhaps more importantly for Shoigu, within Putin's court. To me, I think, and this is pure speculation, but when Shoigu is making the argument to Putin why this should happen, it seems likely to me that he's saying, by making this change, you'll allow us to have a better shot at resuming offensive operations this year. And I think that the MOD statement sort of speaks to that. It talks about, it justifies the move as saying Russia basically needs a more senior figure to handle an expanded range of tasks and improve cooperation between branches in Russia's military. So to me, that speaks to the argument that Shoigu is likely making, that Putin saying, hey, you want more territory, put me back in charge. Of course, I don't think that was a wise choice. I think Shoigu and Gerasimov have proved their incompetence and proved they're not willing to give Putin bad news, which in the Russian system is really a recipe for disaster, as we saw during the first phase.
Yeah, this really is kind of stunning. The Russians over the last several months have certainly stabilized, and going back to the losers, the generals who brought you this debacle. I'm really a little bit surprised that Putin is willing to go along with this, but again, we're not flies on the wall, and seeing and hearing these conversations, really wish we can do that. All right, John, give us the bottom line here. What do we think is going to be happening in the next several months? Do we think the Russian mobilization is going to give the Russians more firepower, greater ability to go on the offensive? Go ahead and give us your quick take on this.
Sure. So as I've said previously, I do think Russia will try to relaunch major offensive operations. The Ukrainians are obviously warning about that from their commander-in-chief and others. To my mind, I'm skeptical that Russia can regain much offensive potential. I want to be careful about my own biases in that sense. So I think we do have to keep an open mind. I will be watching closely about the progress in mobilization. We may see further waves of mobilization. So we do have to keep an open mind. But to my mind, I just don't think Russia will be able to regain offensive potential that quickly, and nothing like what they would need to take the rest of the Donbass, and certainly not to launch another offensive on Kyiv, as the Ukrainians are warning. That strikes me as unrealistic.
Oh, let's touch on that really quick before we wrap this up. I've been seeing that, and that strikes me as quite odd. It does seem the Russians are putting some forces, or there's some indications that Russians may be massing in Belarus. But is this just a Ukrainian information operation in order to attempt to get more weapons? I mean, that's the only read I really have, unless these reports are accurate. But I'm not seeing any indication that this is legitimate. What's your take on that?
Sure. So there had been Russian forces flowing into Belarus. I think what they're doing there, and by the way, there's also been some unusual Belarusian exercise activity, really for many months now. So it does, Belarus is doing things they would do if they were going to war. That said, I to my mind, another offensive from the northern direction from Belarus strikes me as unlikely. And I think basically what Russia is doing here is moving mobilized forces into Belarus to train them there, because they lack training capacity back in Russia. You see a lot of instances where, like, volunteers, veteran volunteers are training mobilized Russian forces back in Russia because they lack, because the people who would train them are, in Ukraine fighting. If you look at Russia's semi-annual conscription cycles, mobilization was about double what they usually take in. So even on full capacity, they might struggle to train and equip all those troops. So that's why they're going to Belarus to try to do that. So you're seeing mobilized troops flow in, along with some regular Russian units that are basically trying to restaff with mobilized forces. And then you see them flowing back out into the Donbass, along with a lot of Belarusian equipment that's being taken out of storage and sort of press ganged into the Russian military.
Yeah, and that has the added advantage of giving the Ukrainians the perception that there may be an offensive, which could cause
Precisely.
them to focus some forces there. Yeah, I could not agree with your take on that. I think that's what's happening. Perhaps we'll be surprised, but on this one, look, the Russians really, in my opinion, if their best bet over the next 6 months to a year is try and hold what they have and chip away. That to me seems the best that they can do, unless they do a massive mobilization. But even then, they're not going to be able to mobilize and train and equip these forces quick enough to make them be to have a significant effect on the battlefield. And the defensive, yeah, absolutely. But on the defensive, absolutely. But on the offensive, no, I don't think that's possible. But John, thanks as always for joining us on Generation Jihad. It's great to have you.
All right. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, John, you have a great one. Happy New Year to all of our listeners here at Generation Jihad. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Just a reminder, you could find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review. Thanks again, and we'll see you again soon.